right, everybody, welcome. We are here at another episode of Freedom Hub Working Group. Excited to have you here today. Got another exciting guest. I think you're going to find out. We do want to let you know in advance that you want to see these coming up and also see the ones that we've done so you can register for the new ones. And here we're showing our link, which is a case-sensitive link, and then also where we're storing these videos after. And just to give you a little flavor here, we have an awful lot for you to kind of pick from. So let's take a quick peek here. And you'll notice we've got quite the collection, and you're going to want to come back here and take a look. There's some really spectacular ones as well. And the whole thing's being sponsored by your Freedom Hub. And here we're kind of showing one of the healthcare disruptors that's out there you'll be able to find out about. So we're really excited to have you here today. And so today we have a really exciting guest, like I said, and I'm going to let my co-host Charles Froman give us a little rundown on who is here today.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome, Ivan. Today we have one of my former colleagues from the Cato Institute, who really was one of my favorite scholars when I was there in the early 2000s. He and some of his other foreign affairs scholars would join me in some Capitol Hill fora to really try to, raise some questions about invading Iraq and all the other interventions. And since then, Ivan has gone on to the Independent Institute, where he founded and is the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty. And before that, before he was even with me at Cato, he was with the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, the General Accounting Office, and the Congressional Budget Office. So these are all very major organs in the DC apparatus. And he was always, a really trusted source to audit and call into question some of the intervention military-industrial complex, even the intelligence part of it. He is the current author of a book he'll highlight today, War and the Rogue Presidency, Restoring the Presidency After Congressional Failure. But I hope he gets into my favorite book of his, which is Recarving Rushmore, Ranking Presidents on Peace, Prosperity, and Liberty, because no libertarian or free market person agrees on who the best presidents are. And depending on your criteria, it could be a Democrat like Grover Cleveland, or a former Whig like John Tyler, or even some of the more recent presidents. So that's our guest today, Jeff.
Hi, Ivan. Okay, great for being here again today. And definitely want to kind of turn the floor over to you. I'll kind of showcase a couple things about you while you go ahead and regale us a little bit.
Well, my book's on the presidency. I've also done a lot of books on foreign affairs, and the War and the Rogue Presidency sort of combines the two. It goes through, start with George Washington and goes up through Donald Trump, as far as how the presidency has increased in power from what the founders had originally intended. We can even see this very simply, although there are some lawyers like John Yoo and others in the Bush administration who have a very different view. If you look at the history of the presidency, the founders, of course, were reacting to George III, and they put most of the powers, even in national security. And if you look at the Constitution, which most people don't, most of the powers, even on foreign affairs and national security, are in the Article 1, which is the congressional sphere. And of course, then you've got all the other powers that are enumerated there as well. The executive has very few enumerated powers. Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces, which the founders, of course, took to be narrowly construed as being the chief general and chief admiral when war broke out, and also or was declared by Congress, and then of course nominating cabinet people, including the Secretary of State, and then of course treaty. And that power, of course, was shared with the Congress. They had to confirm. He could propose foreign affairs people as well as ministers in other areas, and then they would confirm them by a majority vote. And then, of course, there was the treaty power, which they also shared, which was 2/3 of the Congress, or excuse me, only of the Senate had to approve those. So, but he did have the power to receive diplomats. Now, the erosion of congressional power really started a bit even in George Washington, because he wanted to be a leader in foreign policy. And of course, he declared that the U.S. was neutral between France and Britain, the superpowers at the time. Of course, even though we had still had an alliance with France, and it was a good policy, I think, to stay out of that war among the superpowers of the time because we were a weak nation. However, it really did. The policy was good, but the way he did it, he really should have let Congress decide that because it sort of eroded their policy to declare war. So it started right off, and he also created this idea that there's some sort of executive privilege, which is very questionable, I think, and that is withholding Indian treaties and the specifics of the Jay treaties from the Congress. So even from the start, there was some erosion. However, the presidency at the end of the 1800s, if we go more than 100 years ahead until the Spanish-American War, was virtually the same office. There was some erosion over time, and there were pockets of very strong presidencies like Jefferson, Jackson, and of course Lincoln during the Civil War, who ruled more or less as a quasi-dictator. But then we went back to the sleepy late 1800s and everything went back to normal until we got to William McKinley during the Spanish-American War, who was really the first modern president. We now had a national press, and he was the first president. And what I mean by modern president, it was the biggest development of the presidency since the Constitution was created by William McKinley, and that was the bully pulpit. People credit Teddy Roosevelt, his successor, with doing it. And what that really means is you now have a national press, so the president can go over the heads of Congress and drum up support directly for his policies, rather than having representative government where you have the people representing their districts and states. He goes over their heads and drums up support for whatever policy he's promoting at the time. So this was a big development. Of course, now carry it forward to the present day. We, of course, not only have, first we got radio with FDR. He became a master of radio, TV. John F. Kennedy became a master of TV. And then, of course, Donald Trump and, Obama and Donald Trump became masters of the social media. Obama reluctantly, and of course, Donald Trump more assertively. But anyway, so we go along and then get to FDR, the second Roosevelt. Well, let's first discuss Wilson. Wilson was a key player in the expansion of federal government because the model of expanding government was really not FDR during the Depression, it was Wilson. They used the war model. Hoover and FDR during the Depression brought back the war model, and even many of the people who headed the war agencies for the Great Depression. And of course, we went World War II. So FDR took the presidency to first among equals. Of course, for most of US history, except probably during the Civil War, Congress was the first among equals. Then we go to Truman, who was the first imperial president. And what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, that's really two things: the institutionalization of the presidency. The National Security Act of 1947 created the National Security Council, the president's own CIA as a dirty tricks operation, and also his own intelligence agency, because previously he had to rely on the military for intelligence. And of course, it unified the command of the armed services, which had never been unified or even cooperated much before that in the Department of Defense. And then you had the Council on Economic Advisors as well, in addition to that. So, and then the second thing is, he brought back Alexander Hamilton's moribund doctrine of inherent executive power, of which there is nothing to support, despite John Yoo and some of the neocons. There's nothing in the original Constitution to support that or anything else. The commander-in-chief power, it was not inherent, and there wasn't all these unspecified powers, because of course that would defeat the whole purpose of enumerating the powers both in Article 1 and Article 2, which the Constitution does. So we go forward with this imperial president, and then after 9/11, of course, George W. Bush expands the presidency and tells us that he doesn't have to follow laws in time of an emergency. And then Obama continues that, and now we're in Trump's presidency, and he's continued a lot of the same things, and he's also eroded even more of the norms around constraining executive power. So we really have a problem at this point. After 9/11, I call the last three presidents the rogue presidents, because they've become so much more powerful. And in this case, we can see that because Trump is asserting breathtaking power over cooperating with congressional investigations and not doing it, et cetera, and saying Article 2 gives me, I can do anything I want, which of course the founders would all have heart attacks at the time. But of course, it's not all Trump's fault. I mean, this has the presidency has grown, particularly since World War II and Truman, and then on through 9/11. Every time we have a crisis or a war, the power expands, and we're just used to it now, unfortunately. So that's where we are today. And of course, that this whole process has colored my other book, Recarving Rushmore. So some of the presidents that stuck within their modest role, who are unexciting to most historians, I think are very good, like Tyler, Grover Cleveland, some of these presidents. And of course, the ones who really went off the reservations are, like some of the more modern presidents are less appreciated by my analysis. However, I don't go strictly by the old presidents were good and the new presidents were bad. You have to take a president to evaluate. I think you have to take the president at the time that he was president. For instance, Harding gets pretty good marks, and almost no historian gives Harding marks because of the corruption in his administration. However, he was not involved in that. So that's an example of where he's not a recent president, but he's certainly a modern president after William McKinley on through are what I call the modern presidents. So, but he gets fairly good marks for reducing the government, et cetera. And of course, there are presidents that when the government was really small at the beginning of the country, such as Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson was great for religious freedom and also for the Declaration of Independence, but his presidency, he did some things right, reducing the national debt, et cetera, which is you can't sniff at that, but he also created a draconian embargo, purchased the Louisiana Territory in very unconstitutional circumstances, even though he knew better, et cetera, et cetera. So his presidency, although he's certainly a great American, his presidency wasn't exactly stellar, and neither was Madison's. Of course, Madison is a great American for the Constitution, et cetera, but their presidency wasn't that good. And so those are examples of presidents who, although they had a much smaller government at the time, tended to increase the government a lot, and so they're not rated as well in my book. So some of the modern presidents are rated well, or at least good. I wouldn't say any of them are great, but most of them are bad in my Recarving book. So that kind of is a synopsis of both books. And basically my Recarving Rushmore evaluated them on peace, prosperity, and liberty. And also, did they stay within the founders' original conception of the modest office that the presidency was supposed to be? And you can know that that's true by the very title that they gave. They didn't call him a governor. Of course, they weren't going to call him a king since they'd just broken away from him, but they didn't also call him a governor, which was a more powerful office relatively speak to the legislature. They call them a president, one who presides at a meeting. So only now do we think of the president as an exalted person that goes around in motorcades of limousines and that sort of thing. But at the time, president was a more, it was a diminished title compared to governor. And so this is how they envisioned the presidency. It was supposed to be you would carry out, hence the executive branch, you would execute what the laws that the Congress passed, and therefore that would be both domestically and internationally, with declaration of war being the thing that the president would carry out as commander-in-chief of the armed forces on the battlefield, and of course the militia, if they called those up into national service. And then domestically, he would execute the laws as passed by Congress. He wouldn't, in time of emergency, say that I don't have to follow the laws, which is where we're at the current time. So it's changed dramatically over time. And I think that's unfortunate for the Republic. And it's no single person's fault that that's happened. Both parties are at fault. In fact, in the book, we see that at least my ratings don't really correspond with political parties. Of course, the parties have changed over time, even been replaced by other parties. And then the Democratic and Republican parties have changed their philosophy over time as the Republican Party, and I would also argue the Democratic Party are changing even before our eyes. So partisan labels are not necessarily a good guide to what actually happened in reality. There's a lot of rhetoric on part of both parties, but oftentimes they really don't do what the rhetoric is saying that they're going to do. Sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad, but you can't always tell what the president is going to do depending on. Sometimes it's easier for the president with the rhetoric to go the opposite way, like for instance Richard Nixon going to China, or Bill Clinton reforming welfare, etc. So it's often easier politically because they have that reputation. They can say people aren't going to criticize them as much if they do something that's sort of against that, what their reputation is. So these are many factors that go into these my evaluations of the presidents and recarving. One other thing, historians have several biases, and then I'll just stop. I guess people can ask me questions if they want to ask me questions, or we have a discussion, or however you want to work it. One last thing is that historians have biases on how they evaluate presidents. The normal bias is that historians like activist presidents, both foreign affairs and domestically. They also like charismatic presidents like Teddy Roosevelt. And I would say McKinley is probably a more important president than Teddy Roosevelt because, as I said, he was the first modern president, but he was kind of a dull guy or whatever and didn't get too much attention. And then of course the last thing is whether they're a president during a crisis or a war. And even Teddy Roosevelt was, he's a very belligerent president by nature. He liked warfare because he thought it was genuinely good. Most presidents at least make the attempt to say, well, we don't like to get into wars, but we're forced to. But Teddy Roosevelt really loved to get into war. Curiously, when he was president, he wasn't that belligerent. And I think maybe the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, where he fought a nasty guerrilla war, counterinsurgency warfare against guerrillas and killed 200,000 Filipinos. He was kind of, and also the nation was ready to not do that anymore. And I think that constrained him as well. But he lamented the fact that he was never going to be regarded as a great president because there was no major war during his time in office. And he was actually right about that. He's considered by mainstream historians as good, but the war presidents are all considered great because they were president during a big war. The bigger the war, the better. And so that's kind of a curious way we evaluate presidents. I think I'll just stop there. Are there any questions?
Okay, that's great, Ivan. Those are some interesting insights there. One of the presidents who's up on Rushmore and always gets a lot of praise and accolades and forever was idolized. And then of late more, there's a certain segment where suddenly he's becoming rather excoriated. And I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln. So what kind of is your take on him as a singular figure as a president between what happened? Because, talking about wars bigger the better.
Well, of course, the Civil War was the single worst thing that ever happened to this country. And people always say, well, he won the war and freed the slaves and that sort of thing. But he famously said that before he was a moderate on slavery, he famously said, well, my goal is to save the Union, and I'll free all the slaves if I have to, some of the slaves if I have to, or none of the slaves. And in fact, he was supporting a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the slavery in the existing states, not in the West, in an expansion. That's what the Republican Party, one of their main platforms is. They didn't want slavery in the West, but in the existing states, he was going to make it permanent that there would be slavery. So it's kind of odd. And then, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, he sort of even admitted at the time backhandedly that it was a gimmick because it only freed the slaves that were not in areas of the South that weren't under Union occupation. So that meant that there was really no freeing of the slaves. The 13th Amendment eventually freed the slaves. He had some role in passing that, in helping to convince Congress to pass it. But of course, the constitutional amendments are the only thing in the U.S. system that doesn't involve the president. It goes to either, mostly they go from Congress to the state, either ratifying conventions or legislatures. Excuse me. So his role in freeing the slaves was very much different than people think. Also, my main problem was in the 1840s, he was for, when you look at what happened in the United States compared to how all the other countries in the world freed their slaves, ours was the absolute worst catastrophe that ever happened, because in the 1840s, he was for compensated emancipation of the slaves, but then somehow he wasn't for that, and he was very willing to go to war because he thought it was going to be a short war. And of course, people are always overly optimistic about how long wars are going to last. That seems to be universal, and I'm not sure why that is, because so much can go wrong in a war, even if you're the big excuse me, gorilla on the block, as we have been in some of our wars. So tough can go wrong. But anyway, he thought that it was going to be a quick deal, and so he got into this, and he forgot all about compensated emancipation. Excuse me, until 1862, when the war wasn't going well, and so he tried it with the border states, but by then they weren't interested, and of course the South, it was too late to bring the South on board with that, since they were already fighting. But if we would have had compensated emancipation, as most other large countries who freed slaves did that, instead of a war, of course, we would have had much less antagonism after the war. And of course, this freeing of the slaves was only temporary, really. It was only sort of a name after a while, because the state governments took over again, and they, from the military occupation. And once the military occupation left, the South just culturally wasn't there yet on that. And so, and then we got, of course, the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations developed. And of course, we had the worst of all worlds. The slaves are nominally free, but they had black codes where they ended up working for their old masters, or they had Jim Crow starting in the 1890s, where they were discriminated against and second-class citizens. And of course, that they erased their right to vote in all these places in the South. So the question is, and part of that was the the South wasn't ready for it. And part of it was that the South was bitter over the results of the war because a lot of Southern territory had been scorched, particularly in Sherman and Georgia, South Carolina and North Carolina, and but other places as well, Shenandoah, Phil Sheridan, et cetera. So that they were really mad, and who did they take it out on? The African Americans at the time. So the question is, when you put it into that context, Abraham Lincoln was too quick to go to war because he deliberately, against his military advisors, he resupplied Fort Sumter, and he knew what would happen because they had sent Buchanan, the previous president, had sent a ship down there to resupply the fort, and it had been fired on by the Confederates. And so, of course, Lincoln knew what would happen, but he wanted them to fire on bread, as he said. And so, I think he was too quick to go to war, and he should have at least tried some sort of a compensated emancipation. So, by world standards, I think Abraham Lincoln failed because it's better, no matter what the cost of the war. I guess it's easy to say in hindsight, but the cost of this massive war in lives and money would have any sort of compensated emancipation scheme would have been much less expensive, both in lives and money. So Lincoln doesn't really rate very highly with me, simply because I think we assess him from he won a great war and he held them together, but he wasn't a very good in managing the war. Not like FDR was much better by sort of staying out of it and working on his stamp collection than Lincoln was, because Lincoln made a lot of mistakes, and Lincoln was if anything, he was a partisan politician, and many of the generals he had were political acts rather than military people. So both in managing the war and avoiding the war, I don't think he gets very good marks.
No, I'd say not in that contextualization. No, that's for sure. Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff, and great survey, Ivan, of our warmongering presidents. Let's touch a bit on the current kerfluffle with Trump's chess, or is he giving in to his warmonger advisors? What is he doing? I mean, it seems like this assassination may not have been as catastrophic as feared if Iran backs down, but one never knows with this guy. So what is Trump?
Well, I think, he pledged to end the endless wars, but of course, we still have about 200,000 troops overseas, and that includes on naval vessels patrolling far-flung places. But of course, he's just increased the troops in the Middle East, where he especially wanted to reduce troops by about 18,000 troops. So this was not a very smart move, because it's not over. Iran is very wily. The Persians have had thousands of years of culture, and they've been around. They've had their own empire way back when, in the BC years, and they're very wily. They use indirect means. So essentially, how they responded was they're basically saying, well, okay, you've got us on the main show. You're much more powerful than we are, but we're going to hit targets, indirectly at U.S. embassies. And we have a lot of targets. We have a lot of troops right around their area there, and all the countries are right around there. And also we have embassies, we have businesses, tourists, other things going on in the Persian Gulf area. So I don't think we've seen the end of it. They've merely converted a battle they can't win, which is a conventional battle against us, into a battle that they're going to do better on. And we have a precedent for this. Back in the Reagan administration, he started up with Gaddafi because he thought he was a Soviet stooge. And he was allied with the Soviets. But the problem was, Reagan used conventional airstrikes and carriers and that sort of thing. But of course, Gaddafi and the conventional wisdom is that Reagan put Gaddafi in his box. But of course, what really happened, if you look at the historical record, was Gaddafi just went underground, commissioned his own terrorist organizations, and also had terrorist groups like the Red Army in Japan do terrorist attacks against U.S. targets. So and that's probably what the Iranians will do too. So it'll just, the Iran, as some of the officials have even said, we got rid of Jimmy Carter with the hostage crisis, and now we're going to try to do it with Reagan. So we'll see if they actually are successful in doing that. But I really don't think it's over at this point. It's the reason that this has raised such hackles is because, we've declared a portion of the Iranian government a terrorist organization, but that's not usually done. Usually governments are given a break. Maybe they shouldn't be as far as their tactics, because of course governments have probably over time, over the centuries, committed more terrorist attacks than these small little groups because they're more powerful and they oftentimes kill civilians. But I think we sort of label, in my view, if you're attacking military people, especially if they're overseas, I'm not sure you can call that a terrorist attack. They have indirect hit and run tactics, but I consider a terrorist attack as when you blatantly kill civilians to get them to pressure their government to do what you want them to do. And so, the Iranians, the terrorist list is very political over time. And certainly this guy was certainly no saint, but he also was a government official. And the reason that governments don't do that, usually assassinate other government leaders, is because, of course, other governments can do it to the U.S. as well. So you have to be careful when you do that. And like I said, I don't think this is over with now. So we'll see what happens. But I predict that the Iranians are always very clever and wily in what they do. And they've been a very formidable adversary because of that. They don't have as much power as we do, but weaker countries have been very successful over time in winning not only guerrilla wars, but sub-guerrilla wars, which is basically what terrorism is. So it's sort of a risky move to do that, but it is what it is. I guess he did it, but at least he didn't bomb Tehran, not so far. So that's good.
One little interesting wrinkle on it, because like you said, who knows where it's going to go, and it's kind of go where it's going to go based on what happened, and they kind of had a moderate response. But the interesting wrinkle was when they made the mistake of shooting down that civilian airliner, which created this interesting schism within the country itself, which is totally independent of all of what we're discussing here with what Trump did or whatever else militarily, because there's always been that disgruntled undercurrent, and that sort of kind of ripped the mask off a little bit almost. What do you think the ramifications?
Well, they had massive protests. I think that's a triggering event, but there's massive protests before this all started.
I know, and I'm just wondering, is this going to be a la like Hong Kong, where this is the one that like really started to start that whole avenue building up even more than it had ever been?
Right, but then you have to ask yourself, well, when your enemy is, basically in trouble, are you going to go to the government's rescue? And of course, that's what the Soleimani was very popular there. So, it's possible for Iranians to hate the U.S. because they've been inculcated that for decades now. And it's also possible for them to hate the regime. But I think at the margins, it's probably not a good idea to hit Soleimani simply because, why interfere when your enemy is, imploding is too strong a word, but is having domestic problems, because those protests, they came out in support of the government when the U.S. did that. So I think it's a bad time to do something like that.
Sure.
If you want to take out the Iranian government, which Trump seems to, although he claims not to, then you probably should let the Iranians do it themselves.
Right. And then, like you said, it starts at tit for tat, because then I got to take out your next leader and back and forth, and then who knows where that goes. Yeah. David, I see that you have your hand up.
Thank you, Jeff. Ivan, this is David Demarest with Roads to Freedom. Suppose that Rushmore was not limited to presidents. Would you consider major entrepreneurs like Thomas Edison or Henry Ford, or more contemporary ones like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, or even active ones like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think these people have changed our society probably more. Some of the presidents, the best presidents, I think, stayed within their lane. So certainly, if you had a Rushmore of great Americans, there would be a lot of a lot of presidents who wouldn't make it, and other entrepreneurs who've really, changed our society for the better. Should probably be put up there. You could even put Norman Borlaug, who was the scientist who developed the Green Revolution. He's saved 1 billion people, and some people say he saved 2 billion. So that he probably might be the most important person of the 20th century. But certainly people like that should be included. People who scientists, entrepreneurs, business people. They've all been very helpful to pushing our society along. And some of the politicians have taken us backwards. So in fact, a lot of them have taken us backwards. I have in my book, Recarving Rushmore, I have a pretty small list of, the really good presidents.
I was going to say, back on the presidents and what's happened to the presidency, do you see a path back, or are we on some point where we're going to have a tipping point to move back, or what's it going to take?
Well, I think we have to, the Supreme Court seems to be getting more business, especially on social issues, but the Congress is just, even from when I worked on it, it's just gone downhill. For a president to just say, well, I'm not cooperating with this investigation, or he has, actually, it's not just impeachment, he's nixed subpoenas and document requests on other congressional investigation. If you don't have any, that kind of cuts to the core of the system of the 3 branches of government. And I think Congress, they could have charged all those administration officials with inherent contempt. And there used to be a jail. I'm not sure if it's still there or not, but there used to be a jail that they could throw them in for a couple of days, which really makes you come to your senses or whatever. But that's just one example but in my book, In the War and the Rogue Presidency, I go into the 3 major areas of foreign policy. Of course, there's domestic areas where Congress has been lax, and it hasn't been all executive aggrandizement, because the Congress was originally the dominant power, and it was envisioned by the founders of being the dominant of the 3 branches, but they've abdicated a lot of their power over time in the treaty area, in the war power, and in the budget area. And so those are the big areas in foreign affairs that they've relinquished. And I think on domestic affairs too. So this idea that it's all the executive branch aggrandizement, it's the Congress hasn't fought back, and now Congress passes these really vague laws so they can say, oh yeah, every member can say, oh yeah, I'm for the environment or whatever, and then businesses or whatever complain about all the regulations, then they'll go, oh well, you have to talk to EPA, they're the ones who wrote the rules on this, I didn't, we passed the law. But so they deliberately pass vague laws, and so and let these big, huge, sprawling administrative agencies take the heat for any regulations that people don't like, which is probably a lot of them. But so the Congress has given up basically its legislative job, which is its main job, to regulations through, they farmed it out to regulatory agencies. So in my book, I make recommendations to restore Congress's power. And the way you do that, I think, is you have to give individual members of Congress incentives to take the tough votes, like they avoid war votes. They've been trying to get a new AUMF so that presidents like Obama and Trump and Bush can't keep using the same one. Like in this case, they were using the one on Iraq because they were hitting in Iraq, but of course it's much different. Nobody would think that that was the same situation. That resolution was passed in 2002 to go after Saddam Hussein, and now we're going after an Iranian official who happens to be visiting that particular country. So, but the Congress has been, some members of Congress have been trying to get a new AUMF for the war on terror passed, but all the Congress people are too scared to do it, and that's where we're at. But so my book tries to do some restructuring in Congress to give the members more spine to push back against the executive institutionally. In other words, the members of Congress, since their incentives have been separated from the institution of Congress, pushing back against the executive. So I'm trying to bring those incentives more back in line, or at least take them in that direction. So I think the real challenge is to get Congress to push back, and I think Congress is just an empty shell nowadays. And that's unfortunate because it's the Madisonian system of checks and balances is broken down.
You know, you mentioned about that prison, as it were. They, as far as I know, they still have some sort of a holding cell. I'm thinking that potentially all the senators and House of Representative members should spend a couple, 2-3 days locked in that place in succession, and have to read the Constitution, so take a little quiz to get out of there. But as far as what you're talking about, though, you know, is it like a bill that needs to be introduced? You know, because the challenge, you know, for Congress or any of that is it's not a fixed thing. You know, I always tell everybody, look, if we're talking about, you know, Jim Beam whiskey, you know, they haven't changed that recipes forever. But if we're talking about the Red Sox, every so many years, there's new players. So the only constant is the name, but the players change. So how can you make like an institutional change when there is no like fixed faculty, like where everyone's on tenure and they're just going to be here for 50 years, so we have something to kind of work on? How do you move what's been happening away from where it is? Because everyone's just sitting there looking to raise money, get reelected, and the next thing you know, 2 years, 4 years, whatever, they're out of there.
Right. Well, of course, some of the norms have been, just as the norms are being stripped away from the executive branch, the norms are being stripped away from Congress, as well as to what, you know, you should be doing. There probably should be more party discipline on especially on war votes and treaty votes, so that the leadership can push back against the executive. The problem that you have, as everybody probably well knows, is you have the, you know, collective action problem with the Congress, which is not as pronounced as with the executive branch. So, because the executive branch is, at least in theory, a hierarchy. And so, you know, you have to rejigger the incentives so that people are, you know, they can have a more united voice if you want them to push back. And I think that's kind of where we are now, because the Congress is just, you know, usually falls over dead whenever the executive wants to do something like that. Here's the thing they're just working on. It looks like they're going to get a war powers resolution, which is fairly rare, which I'm glad to see, with the Senate saying that Trump can't go to war with Iran unless they, you know, he gets approval from Congress, which is the way the system is supposed to work. However, of course, the problem is cat's already out of the bag, because Trump is going to, you know, veto that. So you have to have 2/3. Well, no, yeah, you have to have 2/3 to override that veto in both houses of Congress, which is not going to happen. So effectively, the real problem is we've come to an informal agreement, which is totally unconstitutional, that the president can just go to war whenever he wants, and the Congress, you know, has to backfill later and approve it. But of course, in the old days, he wouldn't do that because you're not supposed to do that. The Congress declares war unless the country's actually being attacked. So, this vote will be mainly symbolic because he'll veto it, just like he did the Yemen resolution, because he had a bipartisan group of people who wanted to end that war, just as they want to end this one they're voting on Iran, or prevent the war in this case. But so he'll veto it, and then, but the default is that he goes to war. Back in the old days, he would have vetoed it and would have no effect because everyone knew that the Congress had to approve war before the executive could do anything. But the norm is different now, and the Congress has let the presidents, get away with it since Truman. Truman was the first president to not get a declaration of war for a major war, and so the norm is eroded over time, and it's really, I'm glad to see some people are trying to bring it back now, but it's going to be, all these votes are mainly symbolic, and it's something, but it would be better if they had actual, teeth. And it would also be better if the one thing that Congress can still do is they can cut off money, but they don't like to do that when the troops are in the field because they think it's politically iffy, and it is, but sometimes you have to do that. I mean, if the president, all wars are not patriotic, and so if the president gets into something that he shouldn't, whether it was Obama with Libya, whether it was Iraq under Bush, or whether it was if Trump gets into it with Iran, which I think it would be very ill-advised because it'll make the Iraq war look like a picnic with a much more formidable enemy. But I think, that if they've allowed him to do this up to this point, starting with Truman, then it's most of these votes are just symbolic. But you've really got to do what they did eventually in the Vietnam War. It took them a long time to do it, but they did start cutting off the funding for the war at the end to prevent recidivism, if you will, by the executive going back in there. But they've only done that in a couple of times. They also cut off aid to Angola during the Ford administration, but that was the height of the post-Watergate Vietnam, pushback on Congress. And I think we'll probably have another episode of that whether Trump leaves office for 8 years. Maybe we'll have another congressional renaissance.
I was going to say, Mr. Ford, I think you have your hand up at the moment. Are you there? I think you maybe have yourself muted.
I'm still here, yes.
There you go.
My question is, and we probably will agree to disagree, but that's okay. I still want to hear your viewpoint. And that is, where do you consider Andy Jackson as one of the presidents of the United States? Would he make your Final Four?
Well, he did some good things. He fought the National Bank and that sort. I wouldn't say he would make my Final Four, but he was also one of the presidents of the 18th century, Jefferson and Lincoln being the other two, who probably exceeded what the founders had intended. He did, he was a Democrat at the time, and the Democrats were the small government party back then. So he did reduce the size of the government. He fought the National Bank, et cetera. Excuse me. He didn't have very good policies against the Indians, and also the Whigs formed a party against him because they felt that he was exceeding executive power, which he did. But I would say he has a mixed record.
Okay. Hey, David, I see you got your hand back up.
Ivan, what are your thoughts on the Convention of States as a means of dealing with constitutional issues, and on international issues? What about the tool called the Letters of Marque?
Well, I think that's, it is a good tool. Both of them are good tools. The Letters of Marque and Reprisal were originally put in there to commission privateers, which are just basically private pirates, if you will, to, in time of war, set out and they had a private interest in attacking enemy ships to get whatever treasure they were hauling or whatever, or just to bring the ship back. And it had value for either used for on our side of the war, or for wood to make new ships or whatever. So it's not used anymore. The problem that you have with that is that the United States has signed a treaty which agrees that we're not going to do that. So you'd have to abrogate the treaty. But it basically shows that the founders had intended Congress to approve even limited military operations. And of course, we don't do that anymore. Like if you're going to kill Soleimani, or you're going to do a tomahawk strike for Syrian chemical weapons, or in Obama's case, you're going to take out Muammar Gaddafi, these small wars. Now people just say, oh, well, the executive can do it. But even back then, in the letters of marque and reprisal, they had intended Congress to approve even smaller wars. I mean, if you look in the the Constitutional Convention debates, it's very clear what the founders intended, because they had make war in there, and Madison's notes said they changed it to declare war. And the reason that they did that was because the president, he and Elbridge Gerry changed it to declare war, because they wanted the president to have the capability of self-defense in emergencies when the Congress was out of session. Of course, the Congress was out of session much more than it was in session back then, because people were working on their farms, and it was a long way to either New York, Philadelphia, or DC, depending on where the capital was. So there might be a situation where the country was attacked when the Congress wasn't able to declare war. But of course, the Congress was supposed to declare war even after the president did a self-defense without a declaration. But that was we were supposed to originally work that way. It's very clear what the founders had intended. And the letters of marque and reprisal was also on a more limited basis, saying that, unless there's a dire emergency and Congress isn't in session, the president should not be doing things on his own. The people are supposed to decide on war through their members of Congress, rather than having one person does. I mean, the Federalist Papers say that. Hamilton even said that, who's the of all the founders, he was the closest to a monarchist that we had. And he wrote in the Federal Papers, we don't want the reason that we have the Congress declaring war is that we don't want one man, taking us to war. Because, they were reacting to the kings of Europe who got in all these wars for, their own reasons. And of course, the peasants and the lower classes were expected to pay taxes and, fill out the armies to get killed, be cannon fodder for the king. So the founders of this country, they didn't want that to happen. And they were quite anti-war, and they also were very anti-standing army, which is hard for us to believe. We didn't have a large standing army until after the in the peacetime, until after the Korean War. So they were always very scared of having those types of things. So I think that, it's very clear that the Congress is supposed to approve even small military operations. And of course, if there's a direct attack on the original conception was, if there's a direct attack on the country, like say when the British invaded in the War of 1812, of course we'd already declared war in that case, but if you had a similar situation where the British just attacked, because we declared war on the British, they didn't declare war on us. In fact, they didn't really want war at the time, but say a power like Britain attacks us, well, okay, then the president has a right to defend us. of course, in U.S. history, we haven't exactly had a really good record of actually defending the country when it's under attack. But anyway, but that's another issue. So, so I think it's very clear what the founders intended in this regard.
All right, well, that was a very nice response there, and I appreciate that. And I wish we could squeeze some more questions in, but we've already reached the kind of conclusion of our time window today. So, Ivan, I'd like to definitely thank you so much for being here. This was really quite exciting and interesting, to be sure.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on.